Wheel City. Self-care Sunday. Yo. I'm like self-care on Sundays with a day off on Monday. Private jet on the runway, taking off, going one way to the top. Whoa. Who said the sky is the limit when I'm high is my vision? On Facebook Live, going live in a minute. Don't mind me, I'm just minding my business. Breaking news, doing interviews, but it's not about me, I'm doing this for you. Matter of fact, no, I'm doing this for proof that a self-care Sundays and dreams come true. Really do.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Self-Care Sundays podcast. We are excited for this week's guest, Bushra. But before we get started, I wanted to ask for your help supporting the podcast via Patreon. Patreon allows our supporters of the show to donate a monthly amount to help with our costs, including monthly maintenance fees, and to help pay our audio engineering. We'd also like to raise enough money to hire a transcription service to make our podcast more accessible to everyone. If you'd like to help us out, please check out our Patreon at patreon.com/selfcaresundayspodcast. That's patreon.com/selfcaresundayspodcast. Thank you in advance. It is the generosity of our listeners that helps this information be accessible to so many people in the first place. Let's get started. Hi, Bushra. How are you today?
Hi, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. So I'd like to start with kind of a general question, which is if you can talk us through a typical day and where you think self-care plays a role in your typical day.
So I think self-care in the beginning was something that I just thought was so taboo. I come from a really traditionally conservative Pakistani family. So saying like I'm going to take 10 minutes to myself wasn't really a thing. Growing up, I would see the way my mom would run the house. She cooked and she cleaned and she also worked and she would drop us off to school and back and forth, and she never took time to herself. So I always thought, okay, no, you don't have to. And if you do, like, I thought it was wrong. This past year, I spent campaigning like 24/7, literally, because I ran for the Cook County Board of Commissioners. And through that, always being sort of like in the public eye, and as a woman in politics, you always have to have, makeup on, and your clothes should be nice, and you should always be quote unquote presentable. And through that, it was stressful. So my skin started breaking out, and people noticed. People took note of that, especially since I'm 20 years old. My hormones are still all over the place. So for me, in the beginning, self-care was wearing face masks. And when you have a face mask on, I would wear the ones that were really bubbly, so I knew I would have to sit down and I can't move. Otherwise, my face mask will get all over the place. So it started off with skincare, because I think that's when you have blemishes on your face, other people can see it, and then it's the first thing you see when you look at yourself and you're like, okay, I'm not doing well internally.
Yeah, it's so interesting how that it's an outward manifestation of your internal stress.
Yeah, literally.
It's like I can see your stress. It's on your face.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So you're talking about how it had started with doing skincare. How did you develop those habits, whether it's kind of over the course of your campaign or over the last year? And by the way, we should just pause to note you were 20 years old and ran for office, and that's amazing.
That's so sweet. Thank you. Thanks so much. I know. I think like this past year especially, I had a lot on my plate because I was working 4 jobs when I first began campaigning, and I was still a full-time student, and I didn't know how much I signed up for until each deadline started coming up. And I think the number one thing that I learned this past year is that it's okay to ask for help. And whether that's help as in like, hey, can you, help me send this email out to this person? Or can you do this for me? Can you do that for me? And I had a swarm of people who offered their assistance, but I didn't know what to ask for. And I think it's because I had like internal trust issues where I was like, no, like by the time I explain how to do this activity, like I can just do it myself. Like it's okay. And that's a not good mindset to have, especially as a leader. Apparently, there's like this fancy quote that as a leader, you do 20% of the work and delegate 80% because you should have this team who is dependable, reliable, and who you can trust to do, the rest of the work that needs to be done.
That's right. And with the podcast and like even in other aspects of leadership that I've had, I've definitely both had that thought, but then I've had the experience of realizing that even if in the end it ends up taking them more time, it actually took me less time.
Yeah.
So, it's like if it takes me, say half an hour to explain something that would have taken me 2 hours to do, and it takes that person 3 hours, it only took me half an hour.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And I think as women, like we have a sense of guilt that comes with telling someone to do something, especially for free. Like we feel guilty, but it's like, you have to understand that this person volunteered to do something because they think that this is a notable cause for them to dedicate their time to.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think I try to be mindful about compensating for labor and not kind of taking advantage of people. But with that said, I think it's really true. Like we mostly, in the volunteer and nonprofit or in campaigns, like people get asked for money or they get asked to do like boring, like manual, like, you know, canvassing or like that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And you have people who have real skills who can help you. And it's like, if you invest a little bit of time in getting them up to speed and aligning your vision, they can do so much if you trust them to do so.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And for my campaign, it was a smaller race, so there wasn't too much to be done on the more, I guess, the front where they would be able to develop more technical or professional skills. But a lot of the work that I needed to be done was the boring canvassing. And I felt so guilty about that too. I was like, I shouldn't even ask people to make phone calls on my behalf. Even when it came to collecting petition signatures, I was like, how can I ask someone to take 3 hours of their day to stand in the cold and say, hey, can you get this person's name? It just didn't make sense to me. I was like, I can't do that to someone.
So how did you get over that?
I think I got over it by sharing to a friend. I was like, I feel uncomfortable asking people to do this. And she's like, well, you understand that they filled out the volunteer form voluntarily because they want to do this, and that this cause of getting your name on the ballot or getting you elected is more than just getting you elected. It's a cause greater than yourself. And I think that's where it came from.
Yeah. I think also, I mean, it's easy to forget, like, you weren't asking anyone to do something you weren't doing yourself and doing more of.
Exactly. And that helped a lot too. Yeah, because I was like the chauffeur, like driving people around and being a part and involved in every single aspect. And that's something you normally don't see political candidates doing. It's so, taboo to see them walking around like, hey, can I get a photo with you? Like they're in the office, and it's like, I'm always in there,
Yeah, no, I think it's important. It makes people feel like you're not asking them to do the scut work. You're doing the same things that they're doing because it's important, and no one's going to above that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you grew up in a Pakistani family. You're obviously young. You're working 4 jobs, which I've never worked 4 jobs, so that sounds exhausting, frankly. How does your identity inform your self-care habits? You talked about that a little bit in terms of what you grew up seeing, but being a woman, like you're talking about like makeup and quote unquote being presentable in a campaign. And even outside of the campaign context, how does your identity kind of inform the way you think about this stuff?
Yeah. So I'm a Muslim woman, but I also wear a hijab. So my identity is the first thing that people see about me. They always see me as like the Muslim woman because the hijab is something that is so just upfront and out there where sometimes you'll notice like the physical cloth before you even see my face, like if I'm turned around, for example. And with that being said, like, I really got tired, especially while campaigning, of being called the Muslim woman doing this. Like in the introduction, like whether I would say it or not, the person would always slip in there that I'm a Muslim. And you wouldn't hear someone saying, oh, the Catholic woman doing this or the Jewish man. So I just got really tired of saying that. But then I was like, I guess I am a Muslim woman, but should it always be repeated? Like, I guess that, yes, it sort of is at the forefront because I'm wearing a hijab, but I don't know. I felt strange always having it be the first thing that we talked about, the first thing that people noticed about me, because at the end of the day, whether I was Muslim or not, I still probably would have decided to run for office because the reasons were greater than my religion. They were reasons of like education and like inequality within taxation and rights as immigrants and things like that, things that you inherently care about as a human, not because you're a Muslim. So I was hyper aware of my identity, and more so than I was, others were as well, because it was always talked about. But with that being said, it's really good that I'm not ashamed of it because that would have been really exhausting.
So did it take you time to get to a place where you weren't ashamed of it or where you kind of had to learn to grapple with it?
Yeah. So I don't think I was ever ashamed of my identity, but I used to feel really guilty about it because when I was in high school, especially, I was chosen to be one of the speakers for like this panel discussion. And later when we're sitting on the panel, I see that there's a black man and a white girl, and then there's me, the Muslim woman. And later a friend came up to me, well, quote unquote friend, and he was like, you only got chosen to be in that panel because you're a Muslim woman who wears a hijab. And to me, I felt guilty about that. I was like, wow, did I only get this opportunity because I look this way? It's something you just really have to get over because you know that there are millions of Muslim women who also wear the hijab. And there are skills that you present and you hold, and it's not just because of that.
It's so interesting because I think we live in a moment where people feel comfortable expressing resentment to communities and behave as though folks get opportunities because of their identities. And I think what you just expressed is interesting, and it's a flip side we don't often hear, which is that people feel, whether it's guilt or insecurity, that the only reason they got an opportunity was because of their identity. And it's like, what about that? Where are the think pieces on that?
Yeah. And especially as a minority, like we have just become, it's something that we are guilty of because we're not granted this sort of privilege, which is why when we hear that there's a possibility that that is what happened, we're like, oh my God, like there is no way that that's what happened. When people live their entire lives like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting. People don't often, I've not heard people often say we had, 44 white male presidents. They only got the job because they were white men.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Which they did, because
exactly.
if they had been brown men, they would not have gotten those jobs.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so you're right. It is interesting that it was said to me in a slur way that like you should feel guilty about this, whereas that's what our entire like nation and any, I guess, like even executive position has been centered off of too.
Yeah, and it's been interesting. I've recently started hearing others kind of among the more thoughtful crowd wondering and contemplating whether, like, should I apply for a certain job that, like I have a friend who's a white woman who works in reproductive justice, and she said, I wasn't sure if I should apply for a job in that space because there's so many women of color who would like to get into that space, and that it's an issue that affects them more. And I think, in some way I felt like, oh shit, like that's kind of sad that you have to think about that. And I was like, well, you know what? I have to think about it. So welcome to the club, sister. Like, I was like, well, like, because I think, the idea is that like white people or men or straight people or able-bodied people are like, they're devoid of those identities. Like if you are white, you are not raced. If you are a man, you are not gendered. And of course we all have all of these identities. It's just some are more normalized.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agreed. No, you articulated that really well. Like you put it into words what I was basically thinking.
So you talked about how it was the first thing, how being a Muslim woman was the first thing that people noticed about you as a candidate. And I'm wondering if you think that affected whether they took you seriously, and if your age affected whether people took you seriously.
So anything that you read about me, like article, newspaper, magazine article, it always says like the young Muslim woman running for office. And before that, it would say the Muslim teen running for office because I was 19 at the time. And people were like, oh, this is pathetic. A 19-year-old can't hold office. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, but you have to be 18 to run for this position. Like, of course, a teenager in that spect can. But when you hear teenager, you think 13, not 19. When I finally turned 20 while I was campaigning, and even after that, people still called me the teenager. And I'd say, well, actually, I'm 20 now. And they're like, and I would see like teen in the headline. So it's almost clickbait. Like it makes for a better story because that's associated with. So I think that's one of the reasons why people did not take me as seriously because of my age, because for some reason they would hear teenager and that's what would stick in their mind. But surprisingly, the most thing that I think hindered sort of the perception that people had of taking me seriously in politics was me being a woman, more so than anything else, for sure. And this, I think you see it across the bat. So, for example, there was a debate between myself and my two male opponents, and there was the local news covered it because, it was like a countywide race. And in that article, it said the two policy ideas that the men presented. And about me, it said, oh, Amiwala wore a stylish light pink hijab to the forum. And then when you go to vote, what sticks in your mind? The policy that the two men presented and that I wore a stylish light pink hijab. So that as women, for some reason, people think that it's okay to talk about our appearances, our clothing, our attire before anything else. And I was not okay with that. But everyone else was okay with that because they're like, well, your name got in that newspaper then, so they'll remember it. It's like, no, they won't. They'll remember that I wore a stylish light pink hijab.
And it's interesting. I'm curious that phrasing, the stylish light pink hijab. I'm wondering if the writer, and I'd be curious to know if it was a man or a woman, thought that they were being like progressive by like complimenting your hijab and being like, I didn't say anything bad about her being a Muslim. And it's like, yeah, but you didn't say anything about what she thought either.
Yeah, it was a man. It was a man.
For sure.
And I saw that and like I was like, well, this reminds me of like the pantsuit obsession that people had with Hillary. Like it happens to us all. So I was like, that's why it stands out that I was like a woman more than that.
I'm curious, you don't have to answer it, but I'm curious if throughout your race, if your perception of Hillary Clinton changed at all. I don't know what your impression of her was before, but I'm wondering if
I had so much remorse for her at the end of it. Like at the end, I was like, God, I can't even imagine what this woman went through. Because seeing that for me, like a county-wide race, and hers was presidential, like it was insane the amount that people talked about my clothing. Like there was an obsession with it at the local level. So I had a fundraising dinner and I wore a red dress because as a Muslim woman, I try to dress modestly. So I try to wear attire that has sleeves in it because it just hijab means modesty, so it goes hand in hand. And I found a dress for my fundraising dinner that had sleeves, and I was like, oh, thank God, I finally found something to wear. Again, I was upset that I had to put this much thought into it, but I did. And it was a red dress, and I'm wearing it, whatever, fundraising. Or later, I see that like people are saying, oh, is Bushra a Republican because she wore a red dress and not a blue dress? I was like, are you kidding me? Like the color? So it's insane. So I have so much remorse for her. I don't know how she put up with all of that.
I think I went through something similar with her specifically. I think she's kind of the most public face of women in politics. And
Yeah.
I had written this piece after the nomination convention where, she came out on stage in the white suit to accept the nomination. And I was like, my reaction, I don't know if I've said this on podcast before, I was like, oh my God, is she going to do this by herself? Like I was so stunned to see a woman there.
Yeah.
And I wrote this like piece about how I realized like I had internalized misogyny that I don't think anyone I know would say that about me, but I was so shocked to see it. And I was realizing that like, I had just never seen it before.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's good that you're able to check yourself about that, because that's like, if you have to say, especially for those who, one, I guess, recognize it about themselves, but don't do anything about it. It's like seeing that, like, yes, it happens. That's okay. But what are you doing to fix that? So,
I mean, I'd like to think I try to do things to fix it. But I think one of the big things is like telling a story like this, because I was realizing that, and that's why I wrote about it, that I said, if I observed myself doing this and was like, that's fucked up.
Yeah.
Like how many people had the same thought process, but didn't observe themselves having it and like corrected for it. So like, I think my observation of myself was like, yeah, sexism played a much larger role in this campaign than anyone is realizing.
Yeah, it did. Yeah. For all of us. And I think especially those who, for example, saw like the stylish light pink hijab comment, like a lot of them were like, we read that article and we didn't even realize what was wrong with it until I posted about it and said, are you kidding me? Like, does anyone remember what the two men wore to this? Well, no, because no one wrote about it or talked about it. And when I said, oh, how ridiculous does it sound when you say, and this man wore a brown suit, putting it into perspective like that is what did it for people to be like, oh yeah, you're right. People, you shouldn't have said that.
It's an odd thing. And it's distracting too from what you're trying to get across. So you mentioned that it was really during the campaign that you started thinking about self-care with the face masks and kind of taking care of yourself. Did you have a baseline of self-care before you started your candidacy? College students are notoriously bad with self-care, so it's like fine if you didn't, but I'm just curious.
No, we literally are, but I was always involved in like a lot of volunteer work and a lot of work and a lot of school and going to events and all over the place. So I always had a terrible sleep schedule. And that was the number one thing that my mom would always stress as well. So I live at home. My options for school, I had 3, whichever ones were in a 10-mile radius of my home. And growing up from a traditionally conservative Pakistani family, like that's one of the things. You live at home. You don't move out when you're 18. And again, that's something that most people who come from culturally conservative families feel ashamed talking about. For me, I'm like, no, this is what it is. Like, this is what I grew up learning. Like, it's fine. It's not that big of a deal to me. So my mom would always be like, you have to be asleep by 11. Like, no, which for those listening, no, that's impossible. There's no way you can be in bed by 11, with homework and, finally showering. And if, oh gosh, you never have time to work out. I don't know how people factor time for that, but that's something I always tried to do, was to have some sort of exercise routine, which I never could keep up with. So I did always pack myself out or make at least one meal for myself, which I think it's almost therapeutic, like knowing exactly what has gone into what you're about to consume and put in your body. Like you literally assemble every single ingredient that goes in there. So for example, most of the time it was breakfast, egg whites, avocado, and feta cheese. And I was like, wow, like I feel so good. Like these are 3 pretty wholesome ingredients that I know exactly where they came from. And I just had this for breakfast because I used to eat out a lot. I still kind of do, but not as much. Like I was forced to because I would only have like 7 minutes to eat between things that I had to do.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's right. I think it's like sleep and then what you're eating, it becomes really hard. It's interesting that you talked about, I noticed you first said conservative Pakistani family, and then you switched to culturally conservative because, as you were talking, and I think it's interesting because, so I'm Indian American, and I did not grow up in a family like that. So for me, like I went away to college, and so obviously, like no community is homogenous.
Right.
But it's true that like culture, like being culturally conservative, is also not a function of a religion or a country. Like when people talk about like quote unquote purity culture, like it's interesting. People talk about that amongst like Muslims, and they talk about that amongst Christians, and like how like a lot of kind of like quote unquote cultural conservatism really spans religion and nationality, and it's really more about ideology and approach.
Yeah, yeah. And I think I like specified that because a lot of the times when even growing up, like whenever it would be like, oh, you can't wear a skirt that shows this much leg, I always thought it was because of my religion and it was masked as that. But you would see then as I got older, I became aware of like Bosnian Muslims and African American Muslims. And I realized that that was the cultural influence in like attire, for example. And I know that even like going away for school or something, that is a cultural thing because I see it amongst, you know, a lot of practicing Muslims who go away for school. So that's nothing in their religion. Yeah.
It was so interesting to me. I read, she's controversial, but I think it's interesting. And there's nothing wrong with controversy. Reading Mona Elthaway's book on headscarves and hymens, and she's talking about that's the title of her book, Headscarves and Hymens. And she talks about how a lot of people think, like you're saying, that headscarves or hijabs are in the Muslim religion, and it's actually it's very cultural. And hijab, if I'm correct, is about modesty, and it's as opposed to like a specific garment, and the modesty is actually for both genders.
Yeah, exactly. Which is what I touched on earlier when I said I was looking for a dress for my fundraising dinner. I said hijab means modesty, which is why I did something with sleeves. Yeah.
No, I wanted to just repeat it because I think a lot of people don't know that. I didn't know that. I had just found out.
No, I agree. Thank you.
I think it's so interesting where I'm like, how much, and I wonder, I started, when I learned that, I started kind of reflecting upon myself and like how much of what we think it means to be American, or in my case, Indian, or a woman, like how much of anything is inherent and how much of it is just cultural and evolves over time.
Yeah. And that's something that I finally became aware of the more I started studying my own religion. Because the way that you're taught, at least for me, the way I was taught growing up, like I was taught to almost fear God. Like if you don't pray, you're going to go to hell, which is instilling fear. But it turns out like if you don't pray, you won't get what you want. You know what I mean? There's a difference in that. So it's switching from like God being the most person you should fear to like God being like the most merciful.
Yeah. It reminded me, not a direct comparison, but my dad used to always say to me, he had like an interesting parenting philosophy, and he said, I never wanted to raise my kids to be afraid of me because at some point you won't be anymore, and then what will we have?
That's a good one. Yeah.
Like his thing was like, I want us to have mutual respect, because if you're scared of me, you'll only be scared of me until you're big enough to fight me.
Yeah. No, even for us, like I feel like we were also brought up being scared of like our family members. And then it wasn't until like you got that age where my mom was like, no, I'm your friend. Don't hide things from me.
But it's hard to make that transition, I think, if you don't like build it.
Yeah.
And kind of speaking in that vein about kind of community really is what we're talking about. How did you foster community or solidarity with other people, whether it's, you know, within your identity groups or across them while running for office? I think, you know, running for office is an interesting exercise because I think it forces you to build a coalition of people who are not like yourself. And so I'm curious about how you, being so kind of obviously othered particularly by like the press and those who perceive you, how do you build community?
So I live in Skokie, Illinois, and Skokie is where a lot of people came after the Holocaust. So it's a very Jewish area. And with that being said, we do have a lot of large immigrant groups. So that's what the majority looks like. It's people who have not, I guess, like come off like the Mayflower. You know, in the 19 or 1400s, or like they all eventually like first, second, or third generation immigrated to this area. But religious majority wise, it's not us. And then ethnic and cultural majority is not us either. So there was no way I could have relied on like just Pakistanis, Indians, and South Asians to bring the vote forward. So, but I felt like that was a good place to start. So I first reached out to my local mosque, you know, in hopes to speak there, to bring awareness to, you know, my candidacy and my campaign, to ask for help and resources. And they turned me away. They were like, no, they're like, she's not actually running. Like it seemed pathetic to them. And then a year later, a month before my election, after seeing the coalition that I had built from all other community groups and organizations, the mosque reached back out and they're like, yeah, during our Friday prayer, feel free to speak. Whereas a year ago, they were like, no, like 501c3, like we can't mess with this. So after I sort of built myself up and built my foundation from scratch, and after I was perceived to be taken seriously, then they're like, yeah, we'll help you now. It's like, I don't need this help anymore the way that I did last time.
It's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, you went to a group that I think is like natural place to start building your base, and they weren't interested. I wonder if they had a perception of like, you know, unfortunately, when you're part of a minority group, one reflects on all. And so if they were wondering if they thought it would reflect like badly on them in some way, until, as you're saying, you were taken more seriously. So who ended up becoming your base? You said you kind of assembled it from a wide variety of places. Was it mostly young people? Was it?
It actually was. It started off from like moms. And I know that's a very vague term, but that's who they were. Mothers from the people I went to school with, and mothers from people who are a couple years older than me, and their parents who were like, hey, did you know this girl? Like, was she in your class or something? And just parents of people who had kids, who saw their kid and was like, my kid could run for office one day. Let's help her. So that's what I mean by moms. And a lot of them had,
Was it moms more than dads?
Yeah. Like it literally was like all moms. By moms, I was mean like the bigger, like, and all of them traditionally fit like the gender role of what a woman would do. So all of them had to like take care of their kids, and some of them worked as well. So with that being said, a lot of them were like, well, we can't help you knock on doors because I have to take my daughter to daycare. And then I work before that, but I want to do something to help. So we did a postcard campaign where all of these, like, again, moms got together at like 8 to 10 p.m. on a weekday, and we wrote postcards to voters. And whereas young people, we'd be like, okay, go knock on these doors. And then people who are a little more middle-aged but want to help out would be like, okay, make these phone calls. But this is something that we accommodated for them. So it started off by them. And they are really active on Facebook too. So I got added to all these random Facebook groups where, again, like all these women were really excited to see me run. So again, another reason why I say mom is because they all were women too. So not only were they women, but they were people who had kids, and they saw, I guess, like me and their child or something. So that's where my base started off. And like I mentioned a little earlier, I was involved in like various nonprofit organizations. So organizers from each of those and like their personal networks is where my coalition came from. So a lot of the people that supported me didn't live in my district either, which is also, I think, something that played a role in my campaign and the outcome of it.
Do you think that the moms were supportive of you? Obviously, because of the kids, but do you think it was because you're also a woman that for them, I've noticed that there is a pride that some women have when they see younger women doing things that they wouldn't have thought to do?
Yeah. That's actually really interesting that you say that. I agree with that. So I actually went to the Illinois Democratic Women's Convention, and it was extremely expensive to go there. So when I went there, there were all these middle-aged women, and they were sitting around, and they were like, look at this. Like, young people do not care. They're like, we used to burn our bras and like do this and that. And like, they're not even at this convention. And they all were complaining about that. And I remember sitting there and I was like, okay, I have to say something about this. So I stand up and I say it costed about $600 to attend this event that is 6 hours long. And this is in Springfield, Illinois, which is 3 hours away from my home. So I found a sponsor who, again, took me seriously because I'm running for office to pay for my ticket and drive me to this event. So I said, it's not that us as young people universally, we don't care. It's that we don't have the same resources that a lot of you do. And that's, again, the stigma attached to younger individuals and their involvement or lack of involvement.
What was the response to the women when you said that?
They're like, oh, we didn't even think about that. We should have a student scholarship next year. And I was like, yeah,
no shit. That's funny. So you mentioned the outcome of your election. How did you deal with the outcome of your election?
So I actually was running against a very established member of the Democratic Party, and I did not know that if you challenge an incumbent, that means like, oh, I'm better than them. Like, to me, it always was like, well, I just want to run for this seat. And there was a rumor going on that the person I ended up running against would be retiring. He had that seat for 16 years. He did not end up retiring. So people took it as war, which surprised me. Like, they're like, oh, you're running against him? Like, don't talk to me like I'm friends with him. And I was like, but we're both running for this seat. Like, we are so cordial and nice to each other. I didn't understand that there was so much, like, people took it so personally. That was the first thing that surprised me. But then there were three of us in the race, and everyone was really surprised at, like, the wave that my campaign was making, because I didn't have a campaign manager or a finance director or any of these things that others did. So it was me just, like, doing what I could. And word of mouth is how my campaign spread. So towards the end of the election, things were looking really good, and I didn't know what I really was up against when it comes to the establishment. So I jokingly say, like, I felt like Bernie Sanders at the end of it, because I did lose to the Democratic establishment, but my campaign made national attention and everyone knew who I was and was excited about me. But the people I really appealed to, the young people, people of color, people from immigrant backgrounds, and women, unfortunately, were the ones who just didn't come out and vote for me. which is what happened to Bernie as well.
Did you see that? So for you, do you think it was a matter of like getting out the vote, that people didn't actually show up to vote?
It 100% was that. Like, they just did not come to vote. After seeing the numbers, I was really disappointed, specifically in the South Asian community, how low those numbers were, because I personally registered thousands of them to vote, and I hosted so many events where we taught them how to order a mail-in ballot, how to register to vote online, and like broke it down for them. And the ones that didn't come out, a lot of them were like, well, we thought she was going to win, because the only campaign they were paying attention to was mine. And it wasn't like, there wasn't a presidential election to have people excited about. It was the primary election. So it was in March, not in November. And that's what it just came down to.
I'm curious. I know that, Hillary has these stories of people coming up to her and apologizing for not voting.
It makes me so mad. Yes, people do that to me as well. And I'm just like, don't tell me you did not vote. Like, I have no remorse for you. Yeah. But exactly, same thing. That's what I'm saying. Like, I never thought I could relate to Hillary more than I do now. Yeah.
It's so interesting. Do you think you would want to run again?
Not anytime soon. If you asked me 2 months ago, I would have flat out said no. And like now, 2 months later, now that I've recovered, I'm saying probably not anytime soon.
Yeah. Do you think I'm wondering, do you think it's like the campaign left a scar for you, or do you think it's that you're not, like, I'm wondering why?
I think for me, it's because I don't want to be the only young Muslim woman running for office to show that this has to be done. I really want others to see what I did and to step up and like end up running themselves. Like, I don't want it to be me over and over. And I don't think that running for office is the only way to make a measurable impact. And I want people to know that. And I really do hope that just my campaign opened the door for someone else. And it doesn't need to be me the next time.
That makes sense. So you talked earlier about your base and getting people out, and you had mentioned your mom and your parents a little bit. How did your parents react when you wanted to run for office?
In the beginning, my dad was always like really excited about it. My mom was like, no. She's like, there was no way you could be running. And she honestly just really feared for my safety. And a week after I announced my candidacy, we found there was this article that we read that a Muslim judge was found in the river killed. And she's like, no. She said that to me. She's like, no, you can't do this. And again, it was just intense fear that she had associated with what it meant to be in politics, like dirty campaigning and like people like releasing your bank statements. And I don't even know what she thought, but like things like that. And towards the end of it, her and my dad were the number one, like, biggest support could have ever asked for. They campaigned, like, literally right by my side throughout the entirety of it. They got all of their friends to register to vote, and they did so much. Like, there's nothing more or less that they could have done for me.
It's interesting. I want to just talk about this a little bit more, because I think when people think about cultural conservatism or religious families or, immigrant families, people think that when people think about traditional ideas and values, I think often that like women are not encouraged to pursue their dreams or to be in public. Yeah. And it sounds like your parents' fears were valid, but we're not about that at all.
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't like, no, we don't want you to do this. It was, we really just fear for your safety, because look at the climate we're in. I announced my candidacy a month after Trump was inaugurated. My mom was like, hell no, this is not happening right now. So it wasn't anything about me wanting to pursue my dreams. It was always like, no, but like, what if something happens to you? Which again, I also think is really valid, but that's the thing about people who are a bit more conservative, like when it comes to like traditional family wise, like you can work with them.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably they would have had the same fears if you were a guy.
Of course. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, I think, maybe not what people would have expected.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's not. Yeah. Yeah.
Just as a final kind of closing out question, I would love to know, what is a self-care habit that you're currently working on developing?
Going to the gym or exercising more often. Long-term wise, hopefully yoga. But for now, like, I really do hope that I can somehow bring being more physically active in, because whether I'm in school or whether I'm working, I'm always sitting for that, because it's like a desk job or just like when you're in class. And since I commute to school, I'm either sitting because I'm driving or I'm sitting because I'm on the train. So I really do hope to incorporate more physical activity when it comes to self-care, because that's so important. And I did it for like a month last year before I decided to run for office, and it changed me so much. But then I literally did not have time. And I know saying that I don't have time is such a bad excuse, which is why it's something I'm working on.
Yeah, it's actually became one of my priorities. That's one of the things I'm working on as well. And I haven't been great at exercising during the week, but I've been making it to a Sunday yoga class every Sunday. And so this coming week, I think, will be like the 4th or 5th week that I make it to that class. And so I'm like, it's a start.
Oh, yeah. That's what I said. I was like, yoga, I think, is a really good place to start. Yeah.
I'm like, if I can make it to the 1 class a week, then maybe I can make it to a 2nd a week and like kind of build from there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that's what's been so hard to incorporate exercise into my lifestyle. So I'm like, well, I didn't do it 3 times this week, so I'm just going to stop until I have more time. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfection is like the enemy of getting something done, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's funny.
So I want to leave it there. Thank you so much, Bushra, and thank you everyone for listening to another episode of Self-Care Sundays. Before we wrap up here, I want to offer a special shout out to our patrons on Patreon. Their generosity makes the show possible. We are especially grateful to the support of our super contributors, Vicky B, Rainu J, Brady K, Bill S, and Ember Shot. If you'd like to support the show and hear your name at the end of our episodes, please check out patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. That's again, patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. Also, feel free to follow us at Twitter at Self-Care Sundays and on Facebook at Self-Care Sundays. Bushra, do you have any social media handles people could follow you on?
Yeah, my political Twitter is Amiwala 2018, so AMIWALA 2018. And you can like my Facebook page, which is just at Amiwala for Cook County Board.
Great. I'd like to thank the person who made our podcast art, Leah Horowitz, and the amazing artists who make our show music, For Real City. On behalf of our producer, Jess Dalbar, and our audio engineer, Kato Zane, thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you on the